Whom the Gods Fear by Wdowski. Chapter 35. Glen woke late the next morning. He was in a sleeping bag on the floor near the hearth, and was still asleep in a bag next to him. The sun was high in the east window. He climbed out of the sack and gently kissed and on her closed eyes. Her eyes opened, and she looked up at him and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Yeager." "Morning, we both overslept. We have a lot to get done today." As he said that, Flora and Rosario entered the front door. The recovered robot behind them walked in on 3 mechanical legs. Its arms contracted into its body. The sensors on its head swept ahead as it navigated itself into the large room. The room was a hive of activity. "Good morning, Mr. Yeager. I should have the robot ready to start on your barbed wire within the hour." Rosario reported watching Glen pull himself off the floor and offering a helping hand to Dr. Hogan to do the same. "You left early." "Actually, Flora woke me just before sunrise. We got there soon enough, but once there, I had difficulty convincing the machine to accompany us back here. I had to finally shut it down and reboot it back to its original factory settings. Which is just as well, since I will have to give a completely different set of priorities anyway. It won't be teaching English anymore." "Good. As soon as they return from the town with the needed supplies, have it begin making the wire," Glen said to Rosario, patting him on the shoulder. "They are back already, Mr. Yeager. So I'll get the bot right on it." Rosario nodded with a smile and led the robot to his computer workstation. Dr. Chang approached Glen. "Morning, Mr. Yeager, Dr. Hogan." "Morning, Doctor. How can I help you?" It was the first time the acne-scarred face doctor in chemistry had approached him since he was hired for the mission. "Is how we can help, Mr. Yeager. I have talked to the other members of the science team about our grave situation. We want, of course, help in constructing the defensive works, but we feel we should also be allowed to fight alongside the Marines. We do not want to hide in the cellar again when they attack. Doctor, there is no reason to put additional lives at risk. We only have 4 additional weapons, the antimatter rifles we recovered. I plan to man one of them, leaving only 3 others. I know I will take one and fight alongside you, Mr. Yeager. I am sure Dr. Tomas and Dr. Han will also volunteer to do so. But we do have other weapons, so all the science team and the technicians can contribute to the fight." Dr. Chang seemed a bit nervous, thinking of the upcoming battle. But he also seemed determined not to cower in the cellar during the life and death struggle. "What other weapons?" Glen asked. "I noted when we were in the storage cellar, they had potassium nitrate, most likely for preserving some of their food. So I took the liberty to join Specialist Stovall on his trip into town to buy supplies." "Oh." "We returned over an hour ago, with 4 additional wagons of supplies. Some of the A-er-shwaaaa from the town returned with us. More have been arriving all morning from all different directions." "Really?" Glen was surprised by this news. Going to the window to look outside, he could see through the crudely made glass that there were already scores of A-er-shwaaaa working on earthen walls beyond the farmhouse and the stone-walled barn. Tree trunks were being driven into the ground, creating a boxed frame that were filled with shovels of soil. A trench was being dug in front of the earth wall as 4-man teams used chain-heavy tree stumps to pound down the earth in the wood frames, compacting and strengthen the walls. Whose idea was this? It was Captain Mahan's. Chang answered, "As I was saying, Mr. Yeager, I went into town with them and was able to obtain more potassium nitrate and also sulfur from their local herbal medicine man. They use the sulfur for disinfecting wounds, much like they did in ancient China and in European 18th century battlefield medicine. I was also able to obtain wood charcoal supplies and scrap iron from the town blacksmiths." "You think you can make guns?" "No, Mr. Yeager, not in the time frame we have, but I do think we can make hand grenades and perhaps even simple landmines. The farmer here has a kiln next to the barn. We started already to make clay balls to house the explosives. We will add with it a mixture of iron scraps and broken glass for shrapnel. Dr. Krug is already working on simple wood boxes for landmines that can be triggered if stepped on. They are loosely based on a World War I German anti-tank model. I have already started making the gunpowder." "Excellent work, Dr. Chang." Glen praised him, but I still do not understand why there are so many A-er-shwaaaa coming to our aid. That is the work of the farmer. He explained. A-er-shwaaaa's father. Yes. He explained to them that we were going to face those warrior types they have. It seems there is a deep, long-rooted hatred for them among the peasant class on this world. He convinced them that we had the power to defeat them and their gods. Chang looked to A-er-shwaaaa, who was talking to some other male A-er-shwaaaa. He had them send out riders from the town in all directions to other farms in the district. They have been coming in all morning ready to work. We came back with 5 full wagons of supplies. We didn't have to offer them anything in exchange. Why is A-er-shwaaaa so interested in drumming support for us? Glen asked. You would have to ask Specialist Stovall. He had a long conversation with A-er-shwaaaa on the ride into town. I should really get back to manufacturing the black powder. Chang answered. Yes, Dr. Chang, good work. Please don't let me hold you up. Glen placed his left hand on Chang's shoulder and shook his right hand. Chang went back to the other side of the room where the science teams had set up their workstations. Suddenly Glen felt something being shoved into his mouth. He instinctively pulled his head back, trying to focus on what he was being forced fed. It's eggs. I made up a couple for you while you were busy with Chang. And responded, holding the silver-tipped thongs with greenish-colored scrambled eggs at the end of it. You sure they are good? He looked at the green eggs. Yes, they're good. She pushed it in his mouth. Think it's St. Patty's Day. Wasn't there a children's book about green eggs? Glen tried to recall. Yes, Dr. Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham. They don't have ham, but I did find a smoked meat that seems similar to pork. She pushed the eggs into his mouth. They taste like chicken eggs. I told you. They're good. Now here, eat. She handed him the plate of eggs with slices of smoked alien meat. Unless you'd rather I feed you like a baby? I can feed myself, thank you. He responded, taking the plate and eating utensil from her. Thank you, Anne. Just next time warn me before you want to shove something in my mouth. Sorry, I was just showing you that I care. I understand and appreciate your gesture. I just have this thing about having unknown foods shoved in my mouth. Perhaps a negative reflex from when I was a child, when my mother tried to force me to eat my vegetables. He took a strip of the smoked meat and bit off a piece of it. He felt it had a very wonderful woody flavor. I will remember to announce what I'm placing into your mouth next time. And answered, would you like some coffee with that? Yes, please. I am feeling caffeine deficient. He followed her over to the dining table and placed his plate of eggs and meat down, taking a seat at the table, and returned with a pot of steaming black coffee and a couple of mugs. She poured them both some coffee. Sugar and cream? She asked him. Just cream, thank you. I never knew you had this domestic side to you, Dr. Hogan. Glen smiled at her as she poured some fresh cream into his coffee. She sat at a right angle to him at the table and poured herself a cup of coffee too. She added also cream and 2 sugars to hers. Nice of you to notice. Her eyes smiled at him as she took a sip of her coffee. When this is all over, I hope you will let me cook a very nice and romantic dinner for you. Glen said, rolling out the R sound in romantic, and laughed at his pronunciation of romantic. I would love that, Glen. Glen then called out to Captain Mahan, asking for Specialist Stovall. Mahan went outside to fetch him as Glen enjoyed his late breakfast and coffee. Stovall returned and stood at attention before Glen. Please have a seat, Specialist. Stovall sat opposite of Glen. How can I help you, Mr. Yeager? Coffee, and offered him a cup. Thank you, Dr. Hogan. He picked up a mug and held it up as she poured it for him. Stovall drank his coffee black, refusing Dr. Hogan's offers of sugar or milk. What did you and A-er-shwaaaa talk about on the ride into town? Glen asked the linguistic specialist. I was answering his questions about Earth. He seemed intrigued that on Earth in our recent history we had the concept that those that worked the land should own the land. That we used to have a feudal system too, but had revolutions that overthrew the noble classes. The ideas of democracy, freedom, and property rights were championed on Earth about 300 years ago. I didn't know you were a student of history. Glen responded. My father more so. It always bothered him how man was no longer self-sufficient. That we depended too much on the machines and the state to provide everything for us. I think he would have loved to have been a homesteader back in the old American West, or the first colonists in New England, chopping out a life for himself in the wilderness. He loved the book Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. I know the book, bit hard to read if you don't understand the terminology of those times. I love the movies based on the book. Glen replied. Supposedly one of my ancestors had emigrated to America from Sweden to become a dairy farmer in Minnesota in the 1870s. My father always admired his adventurous spirit. I think it was one of the reasons I decided to join the Interstellar Marines. I didn't want to become a farmer, but my father and his stories did inspire me to seek out adventures. Sound like I would like your father very much. I think you would, Mr. Yeager. My father is about your age and admires greatly those who can make a life for themselves with just sweat and determination. I know he would like you too. Do you think this is why A-er-shwaaaa has rallied so many of his people to assist us? I think it is, Mr. Yeager. They have never owned their own lands. They work it, sweat over it, bleed on it, and end up getting buried under it, but it is never theirs. It has always belonged to the district possessors and regional overseers. The Amphrathars have historically been the muscle to maintain the status quo. Demi has improved the peasant circumstances, but he has not changed the fact that those in power are still living off the labor of those that actually work. It turns out that merchants and tradesmen in the town do not own their own shops. They are only allowed to keep 20% of their profits. The rest all goes to the ruling classes who own their buildings and all natural resources. They claim it as public property. Property of the people, but it seems only those in power truly possess it and prosper from it. It is the same line the communist and socialist used in the 20th and early 21st century. Glen pointed out. As George Orwell illustrated in his book Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And Demi has not changed any of this. And interjected. No, Dr. Hogan, he hasn't. He has just replaced the top of the pyramid of power with himself and his crewmen. Things are better under Demi's reign, but not that much better. At least according to what A-er-shwaaaa has told me and the other A-er-shwaaaa I have spoken to from the town. This is turning into something much bigger than just a fight between you and Captain Demi. Thank you, Specialist. Please don't let me keep you any further from your duties. Stovall stood up finishing his coffee and went back outside to help translate for the humans and A-er-shwaaaa. You realize you're starting a war, and solemnly informed him. I thought you wanted to find Demi to stop a war. I did. I still do. Glen looked at her, but it seems I may have to start a war to prevent a much bigger war. You're starting a war to end a war. She answered, that sounds as crazy as that Vietnam War American officer saying they had to destroy the village to save it. Very often life only gives us the choice between two evils. He finished his meal and coffee and stood from the table. Without the spooky calm, we need to return to the fleet to inform them that we have found Demi. They need to know that the Shingnis never took him. It is clear Demi doesn't want us leaving this world alive. I do not see any other choice but to fight. We are greatly outnumbered. Our survival may depend how much these people can contribute to the fight. I understand that, yet you still cannot dismiss the irony of it. And stood up too. What can I do to help? I fear we are going to have a lot of wounded. I need you to start preparing for that. He reached out and held her by both of her shoulders, focusing on her as if she was the only other person in the room. She seemed cuter and more attractive to him each additional time he looked at her. I'll set that up. She kissed him and went to work, and was soon replaced with A-er-shwaaaa, a head taller than Glen, like most A-er-shwaaaa males were to humans. He looked down at Glen with his boyish porcelain white face, and smiled, revealing perfect white teeth. A-er-shwaaaa placed one of his 6-fingered hands on Glen's shoulder. Glen looked up at A-er-shwaaaa and smiled, nodding to the alien that he understood even though no words in either of their languages had been spoken. It was the first time the A-er-shwaaaa tenant farmer did not cower to Glen as a god, but finally saw Glen as a man, an equal, a friend, an ally. A-er-shwaaaa called out to his daughter to translate for him. When Flowara approached A-er-shwaaaa, spoke to Glen. Glen looked at A-er-shwaaaa, wanting to understand his words. My father wishes to show you the work they have started. A-er-shwaaaa led Glen outside, his daughter also in tow. The sunlight took a moment for Glen's eyes to adjust, but as his eyes did, he saw at least 300 to 400 A-er-shwaaaa males alongside the Marines constructing the earthen wall and trench before it. It was not laid out just from the farmhouse to barn, but was being constructed to encircle the whole homestead. A-er pointed to the surrounding hills, and Glen could see hundreds more of A-er-shwaaaa males descending upon them from all directions. Many a top wagon with more building supplies and food. A-er spoke again. My father says that he told his people how you had plucked the flying carts of the gods out of the sky. How you and your men are here to free them from their yokes of burden. That you will defeat the gods and the A-er-shwaaaa so we the A-er-shwaaaa can own our own lands to enrich ourselves and our families, not the relatives of the district possessors and overseers. Listening to Flo-Wara's translation of her father's words, he realized that Stovall and Em were both right. This was no longer just a fight between him and Demi. Their actions were causing a rippling effect that would change this world profoundly. Demi may have freed them from hunger, but Glen was now given the burden of freeing the A-er-shwaaaa from oppression. Flo-Wara continued to translate for her father. We wish only that we can keep the fruits of our labor for our families. No longer will we have to live under the heels of the A-er-shwaaaa. Flo-Wara, looking up at Glen, asked Glen for herself. Can you really defeat the A-er-shwaaaa? Glen wanted to say that he had no idea, but instead replied, we must and we will. Please tell your father that this will be no easy task. Many lives may be lost, but I wish that he and his people no longer feel held down by others. Flo-Wara looked up to her father and translated Glen's words to him. A-er nodded to Glen that he understood, and again placed a friendly hand on Glen's shoulder.